Okay, and we are live with Hadi. Welcome to the session about Ktor, the very nice framework by JetBrains developed with Kotlin for Kotlin developers. And Hadi is going to talk about the framework, and we'll see how all the nice things about it, right, Hadi?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. You can share the slides, and I'm going to disappear from the stream, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anton. So essentially, I'm all alone here. Okay. Anyway, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining this session on Ktor. The quick title of Ktor, which I copy pasted from our website, is an asynchronous framework for creating microservices, web applications, and more. Ktor is a server-side and client-side framework, but we'll get to that in a moment. However, I know the industry that we live in. I know that certain things are trending. So for those that are interested in blockchain and distributed microservices, there is a title for you too. Although recently I read that blockchain is probably one of the most useless technologies ever invented. But enough about blockchain. So what is Ktor? Ktor is a server. Ktor is also a client framework. It is multi-platform, and it is Kotlin through and through. It's built from the ground up using Kotlin, obviously relying on libraries of the JVM. And in cases where it's multi-platform, it relies on native libraries and JavaScript. But the code itself is basically all Kotlin. It is also asynchronous, and it's using coroutines, which I hope that most people are familiar with when it comes to Kotlin and asynchronous programming. Ktor is open source, otherwise known as free. It is an Apache 2 license. We've developed it at JetBrains, and we continue to work on it. It was initially started by my colleague, Ilya Ryzhenkov. Right now, the team is around 8 people, and we continue to grow it. And it has been inspired by other frameworks such as Wasabi and Kara. For those of you that have not heard of either, Kara was a first attempt by a third-party company of creating a Ruby on Rails style MVC framework for Kotlin. Wasabi was my intent to create an Express.js style framework for Kotlin. And given that Ktor was kind of came about after Wasabi was moving in the same direction, we tried to basically align efforts and focus on Ktor. Ktor can be used for multiple things, to create server-side applications, and these could be HTTP applications where you have HTTP endpoints, where you have RESTful systems, or you can create websites, you can create static websites with it, anything that you can think of in terms of serving up content from the web. You can also use it for socket applications, and you can also use Ktor for client-side connections. That means that if not only using Ktor for HTTP clients or sockets, but combine these two to create a nice scenario where you have, for example, microservices and you have one service talking to another. Now, Ktor's goals are to be simple, to be flexible, performant, and cross-platform. And this is probably by far one of my favorite slides, because I would never write a slide that said Ktor's goals are to be complex, really rigid, slow, and on a single platform. But this slide looks much better. But those goals remain.
Hadi, you are not sharing the slides actually.
Oh.
I thought you are doing the intro, but you might want to share the slides.
Oh, I'm sorry. Shame on me. So now you can see my slides, right?
Perfect.
Well, you know what they say, Anton, right? They say that you should always be prepared to give a presentation without slides.
So yeah, it seemed so flawless until you mentioned the slides.
Exactly. I could have just shut up about those slides.
Yep.
And of course, let's not forget the fact that I do have the slides, and that's not what they say about giving a presentation without slides. But anyway, now you see the slides. You see that they're quite horrible. It's okay. It's the best I could do. I'm sorry. Now, let's look at some code, and perfect timing for you, Anton, to tell me that you can't see my slides. So here is the basic down-to-earth Ktor server. And as I mentioned, and as the title of the session mentions, we're looking at Ktor on the server. So I'm not going to be covering much, if any, client-side development here. It's mostly all going to be about the server. So here what we have is your basic equivalent of what would be a hello world server for Ktor. And we start by creating an embedded server. And of course, we can host our server in a container, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But essentially, you create your instance of the server. And then with Ktor, you can select the engine that you want. In our case, we are using the Netty engine. So under the covers, it is running Netty for all of the communication. And then we do a server start. Now, that alone isn't going to accomplish much because we want to be able to respond to some endpoint. So that's where the routing comes in. And here we are defining the routing. And we have a simple route, a single route, which is get / which is essentially a home page. And all that is doing is responding with some text. So we're saying hello Ktor and then content type text plain. And that is as simple as it gets when it comes to Ktor. With that, basically, I have an HTTP endpoint listening on port 8080, and it's going to respond with hello Ktor. Now, we'll see a little bit more code in a moment, but let's examine a little bit what the structure of a Ktor application should be. So Ktor is divided in the concept of modules. Now, this essentially means that you can group your application any way you want. You can have a module for the entire application, or you can have a module that encompasses multiple aspects of your application, such as customers, orders, purchases, etc. Or you could have a module per component of your application. It really is up to you. The idea behind modules is that you can kind of like bring them in and take them out as needed. And in fact, when we go through the samples, you'll see how I'm using these modules. Now, inside a module is where like the heart of it is. That's where the application itself is, right? So the essence of this is that I get a request. It goes through a routing mechanism, which then redirects it to a point in my application logic, which handles my code. Well, the code handles everything that I need to do with that request, be it write to a database, read from a database, do some processing, what have you, and then send out the response. Now, in between these processes, in this pipeline, we have the concept of features. And a feature essentially can be inserted before the request, after request, before response, after response, and a couple of other places. And these features add functionality to Ktor, such as, for instance, encoding and compression. In fact, the routing itself is also a feature, but it kind of comes quote unquote out of the box with Ktor, because essentially you wouldn't do much with a server-side application without having any kind of routing. So let's switch over to the IDE and see some slides, which I really mean code, obviously. But I did that on purpose because you don't see my slides. So remember the code that I just showed you in our main application. You can see that I don't actually have that here. I have that code over here. And this is something that's a little bit different to what we've seen. So I still have my Val embedded server, Netty, etc. And if I hit run on this, it's going to run it and it's going to respond on port 8080. So you see it's already started, it's already running. I can click the browser and it responds pretty fast, right? The startup time is incredibly fast. Now, in a real world application, you generally don't want to write your code here and set it up in the main entry point, but define a main entry point that basically just says what engine to use, and then pass in some parameters through the command line in arguments, or by default, if it doesn't pass any in through arguments, it will look for a file called application.conf, which uses HOCON notation to define some parameters of your application. So whereas before in the code that we saw over here, I am defining my port in the code, here I'm defining it in my configuration file, which can be useful for having, for example, one for development, one for production, etc. And this is where the modules come in. So this is defining that module that I'm loading. In this case, it is simple KT. So if I go to the simple KT file, you can see that it's essentially loading this module. Now, if we split this and show you the main, you can see that essentially the code is everything outside of this embedded server. So that's the part that's different. This part is being done for us by this application main and the parameters that are in the config file. Now, in this case, the modules tells me which ones I want to load, and I can have this as a comma separated list of values. But for me, I'm just going to be loading a single module per demo because we're going to be focusing on that specific code. So now that I've got this, I've got my module, which is the simple over here. So you can see that it's using the Kotlin notation of the simple KT referring to the file, and then the application function, which is simple, that is defining my module. And now how do I run this? Well, I come to my application and I hit run. So we can press Control Shift Control R and run this, and this will run my application. And you see that it's saying that it's reading the information from the config file. Now it's already running. I can click the browser and have my hello world up. So as I go through these demos and show you the different functionality and features of Ktor, essentially what we're going to be doing each time is just using a different module. So in this case, I'm going to comment out this module and I'm going to add the static. And notice that I'm not recompiling anything and I'm not going to change the application that I run. If I just press Control R in IntelliJ, it's going to run the last application that it ran. Now, the second thing that I'm going to show you is support for static. So Ktor allows you to have actually static files and resources that you can load, and it does that work for you. And the way you do that is by adding this block over here, which is called static, and specifying the URL that is going to act as static. So when I do anything /static, that means that that URL, anything under that URL is going to be static. Now we have to tell Ktor where these static files are located. And in our case, we're saying that they're resources under the folder static. And in this case, I have a single logo file, a single SVG file, which is the Ktor logo. So if I hit run, now if I open up over here, I get not found because I'm running a different application. I don't have a root path. So what I do have is a static path, and I can write static and then Ktor logo, and it will show me the Ktor logo. So again, notice I am not recompiling anything. I'm just changing the application conf file. Now this thing over here is what's called the feature, which we'll get into in a moment. And everything I'm going to be showing you is basically based on features. So let's take a look at HTML. Now, some of you may be familiar with the Kotlin X HTML library, which is essentially a way for you to create HTML inside your code using statically typed. So I have completion. I can write H3 and I can get completion, see all of the different options that I have. So if you're familiar with JSX, imagine the same thing, but with nice completion and all in Kotlin code. Now, this is not part of Ktor, but you can use Kotlin X HTML to render server-side views. So in this case, I want to render an HTML DSL, and I'm going to respond with HTML and set the body information. And the beauty of this is that since it's Kotlin code, I can intermix my HTML elements with any code. So for instance, here, I'm going and creating a for loop that is going to print out 10 items. So we've got this in the application conf. It's pointing to HTML. we hit Control R, and we open up our browser, and then we do HTML DSL, and we get our HTML. And all we get is our HTML. We don't get anything extra. We don't get JavaScript files or anything like that, just pure HTML. Now, Ktor allows you to use HTML, Kotlin XHTML, plain text, and a whole bunch of different support for different view engines that you can combine. So if we go to start.ktor.io, which is one way of starting your Ktor application, we can see that when it comes to view engines, we have support for FreeMarker, Velocity, Mustache, ThimeLeaf, etc. Or you can just use plain HTML. This is for server-side rendering, of course. Okay, let's move on and see some more examples. So far, everything that we've seen is about get. Now let's take a look at some posts. So here what we've got is the two URLs. One of them is going to get back a form, which is this using HTML, the Kotlin X HTML. And then the other one is going to post some data. So this one we're not going to go through. It's nothing spectacular. I mean, it's just everything we've seen so far. I just have a get, and then I'm rendering some HTML, and I'm just adding a multi-part form data. So essentially, I have a form field, and I have a file. Now, in the post, what I'm doing here is I'm defining the post verb, and I am saying to Ktor to receive this as a multi-part form data request. And if it is, then I have access to each of the parts and do whatever I want with them. So you can see that here it's saying if is form item, then Kotlin Smart Casting is saying you have access to the value. If it is a file item, I have access to the original file name and the content type. So if we run this and open up, we can get our form, and I say hello, and then I say choose file. Let's say, for example, Ktor, open that up and send it, and we can see the information right here. So I've got my hello and my Ktor PDF of application PDF. So far now we see HTML, we've got the get, we've got the post. Let's move on and see what else it offers us. This is where we come to features. Before we saw this thing called static, and I mentioned to you that this is a feature. That's essentially the idea behind Ktor, in that it is very simple and lightweight. And then as you need functionality, you add features to it. So what does this feature example provide us? So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to install this thing called default headers. And what I'm doing is installing a feature which is called default headers. So a feature consists of two parts. We have the installation part, where you are installing the feature and optionally initializing some values. And we'll see an example of that in a moment. And then you have the actual execution, which is the feature at work. So in this case, the initialization is essentially just installing the default headers feature. And then the execution, what it's going to do is add some headers as the request and the response goes out. Well, the response goes out. Request comes in, response goes out. So let's take a look at this and see how that works. If I run this, and remember that we have to go to headers, I'll open up and I'll say headers. And it says to us to check the headers. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go to network, refresh this. We see headers. And we see that it's adding some additional headers to our response. Okay, so we see the date and we see the server information. So this allows me to add some default headers. And of course, with Ktor, you can add as many headers as you want. The point here is to understand essentially how this concept of features works. I can install a feature and then I can actually use that feature. So moving on with the features, let's take a look at something a little bit more useful. Not that default headers aren't useful, but let's take a look at some serialization and JSON. So in this case, we've got our JSON file. And here's an example of where I mentioned that you can initialize a feature. So what I'm doing is installing what's called content negotiation. Now, if you're not familiar with content negotiation, Essentially, the idea of it is that when I go to a website, so let's say I go to google.com, and if we take a look at the network, you can see that when I make the request, I send some accept header in the request. See, I send this accept. And what I'm saying is that this is the types of applications that I accept, right? The types of content types that I accept. So text HTML, application XHTML, etc. And then each of these have a weight. Q09, which means that it's higher than Q08, and then 1.0 is the default. And content negotiation essentially consists of the following. I send a bunch of content types to the server. The server says, okay, let me prioritize these based on what you want. Let me see which ones I can serve. And then based on the priority, I will serve you that one. If I do not have, then I will send back a response of media type not supported. So that negotiation is already taking place for you with Ktor when you do install content negotiation. Now, content negotiation sometimes, or most of the time, is also associated with serializing data in different formats. And that's why you can initialize content negotiation with different types of serializers. So we support Kotlin X serialization out of the box. We also support something like JSON out of the box, although this might actually end up becoming a marketplace feature, which is kind of like the direction we're going here. But here we have JSON, and then JSON, of course, has its own configuration properties. And I can say, for example, set pretty printing, set date format, set lenient. All of these are strongly typed and depend on the actual serialization library that I'm using. So when I'm using this feature, I am initializing it and saying I want set pretty printing and I want to serialize now. Now, when I define my routing, here I'm returning customer. Note that I'm essentially creating a class customer that has a bunch of properties. And then all I'm doing here is just saying call response with the model. I'm not worrying about any kind of serialization or anything like that. When the request comes in, if it accepts content JSON, application/JSON, it will automatically respond with that, and it will automatically take care of the serialization. So when we run this and we say /customer, we can see that it gives me back the JSON. So we have different types of serialization support, obviously, but more importantly, note that the content negotiation is taken care of for you, and that all of this is just the concept of the features that I was talking about earlier on that we installed in Ktor. Talking about other features, we have support for authentication. We have OAuth, we have basic authentication, a bunch of different ones. And here I'm showing you how to install basic authentication. So in this case, I am installing authentication. I'm saying it is basic. I'm giving it a name because that's the name that I'm going to be using in a moment to refer to that authentication. With basic authentication, if you're not familiar with it, it requires a realm and then some logic to validate, which obviously this is very, very simple logic that just checks that the name is equal to the password. But more importantly here, it gives you an ID that you can set and then you can later on use in your code. Now, when I want to say that I want some resource protected with this basic authentication, what I do is essentially decorate it. So I say in this case, I have a root get that doesn't require authentication, and then I now have a root a root secure that does require authentication. So I'm wrapping it in this function, and I can have access to that ID principal. So I can say, for example, here, user ID principal, and get access to that information, right? So here I'm going to run this, and if I access secure, you can see that it prompts up a dialog for me to enter the username and password, and then I can access that secure area. Okay, so let's move on. Now, out of the box, we have a lot of features. I showed you previously, if we go to start.ktor.io, you can see that I have in templating, I have static content, location, metrics, session support, compression, auto head, call logging, tons and tons and tons of features, right? And then there's also some community contributed ones. We are revamping all of this to make it look much nicer and providing support for marketplace where people can actually contribute their features. So there is, although, the ability to create your custom feature. And the idea behind custom features is that you essentially create a single class that you intercept the request and you perform some logic. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm creating a custom header. And this custom header has two properties. It has a header name and a header value. And that is defined here in the configuration. So this would be the part where I'm configuring that feature. Remember, I told you that a feature has an initialization part where you can optionally configure it. This is it. I create a nested class that is the configuration of my feature. And then I'm going to essentially intercept that feature and do some operations. And this is where we intercept it in the application pipeline. And we say, okay, here in this case, all I want to do is add a header to my response. So now when it comes to use this feature, all I do is install. I have access to the initialization, which is the configuration, which is header name, header value, and that's essentially it. So if we run this, let's open up the browser and developer tools, and let's refresh that, and we can see that I have my custom headers being returned back, A, B, C, D, E, F. So this means that for me to install a feature, for me to create a custom feature, all I would need to do is essentially implement a single class and override a couple of functions of a companion class, companion object, which is application feature. Now, this is simple enough. We're even going to simplify this furthermore because still it might be a little bit difficult to understand where and how you want to intercept, because if you remember when we're talking about the Ktor features, I said you can put these features anywhere in the pipeline. And sometimes it's not that straightforward how and where you put the feature in what phase of this pipeline. And we're working on simplifying that too. Now let's talk a little bit about routing, because up to now, all we've seen is just some get, etc., and all of them at a top level. So if we come to the routing, we can see that there's different ways for us to organize our routing. So here I have a routing entry and I have get, which we've seen, but I can also define a new route, customer, and then inside that have its different verbs. So here I say anything on the customer and then get post for the customer route. I can also have routes, obviously, with route parameters. So in this case, I have employee. This would be employee. That's the thing about comments, right? When we update the code, we forget to update the comments, and then the comments become irrelevant to the code. And then nobody understands anything. But anyway, here we have a root employee, and then we have the ID, which means that I have access to that root parameter. How do I have access to that root parameter? I access it through parameters ID to string. And there's a better way or a different way to do this, which we'll see later on. If I want to access query parameters, so for instance, customer ID 10, I have access to it via query parameters. But more than the parameters, note how I can also organize the structure of my routing. Here, for instance, I have another example where I have shipment international. So this is essentially shipment / international. And you can nest as much as you want. So we give a lot of flexibility in how you actually define routes. Now, this leads to the next question. How do I structure my application? And if we come to app structure, I'll show you a little bit different ways to do this. Now, contrary to other frameworks, where, for example, certain frameworks require you to have a class and name that class, for instance, with the suffix controller, or have some annotation, or stay in a strict layout of how you define your routes. With Ktor, you can basically define your routes anywhere, because at the end of the day, all they are functions. But that also has the disadvantage of, okay, so I'm new to Ktor, or I've got a large application. How do I do it? How do I structure my application? Now, I've written a blog post that is now part of the Ktor documentation, Ktor routing. If you type Ktor routing Hadi, you can see that there's different options. of how you actually can define your routing. You can define it top down, which isn't very scalable. You can then define it as individual functions and then call these functions in your routing table. You can group them by files. You can group by routing definitions, multiple ways. And if you're interested to learn more, take a look at this blog post, which shows you different ways how you can structure your application, your routes. But one common way at the end of the day, that most of us use, is essentially create functions that are extension functions to the root class. And there I don't have to explicitly define this whole routing entry. I just have access directly to my get, post, put, delete, and then group these in individual files. So for instance, I can have everything related to a customer in a file, or I can have a package customer and then have each route, each action inside a file, inside that package. All of that is up to you. But it's quite common to use extensions to the root function. And then the way I use this is essentially now just define my routing and then the different functions. So home, employees, etc. If I click on home, you can see that I have my get calls. If I click on about, I have my about, etc., etc. Okay, so that's one way that you can group your routes, and it's probably the best way when it comes to scaling your application to have things nicely organized. A combination of files, packages, etc. Let's see what else we have over here. If we go to locations, remember that in the routing, when we saw the routing, I said to you that there's another way for you to access the route parameters over here. And that's where we come to locations, which is essentially statically typed routes. So here I have my routes as well, but instead of having get, as we saw before with like string, what I have is a get and a type. That type is actually a class. It's in lowercase because it's not actually a class as such. It is how we're using to define the routes. And I have my location that is saying what that route refers to. The same way I can have a route with employee/ID, and then I access this as a property of that class. So this route parameter now becomes a property, which I can have strongly typed. So you see I have ID. Now, the benefit of this, of course, is that static typing. And tomorrow, if I rename this route, or then I just rename the class with a refactoring. If I want to change the route string, I change it in a single place. So that is very, very useful. Now, location still lacks certain functionality that you might be seeing this experimental. What does it lack? First of all, we're considering whether we should keep the name location or not, because some people confuse it with HTTP header location, which is not exactly the same thing. Secondly, we want to provide helpers so that you can define static types and create static rules, routes from some functions, because there is a few things still missing, but it is generally a very great feature that I would recommend folks use in applications. Now let's go and see just one more example when it comes to asynchronous. Now, as I mentioned to you, Ktor is built from the ground up using coroutines. And you see that the majority of the code that we've seen, we don't really care about that. We're just writing our code and letting Ktor under the covers handle all of this with its coroutines. You can see that there is nothing there where I have to do a sync, a wait, or anything like that, or anything related to asynchronicity. Now, what happens if I have a long-running process? So for instance, let's say that I have this application where I have a request to get, and it's going to respond with a long-running calculation. Now, technically, Ktor should handle that, but if you want to explicitly put that in a suspend call, you can essentially do that in a very simple way, much like you use your coroutines. Instead of just doing call, you would create that as a suspendable function, and then inside that you would respond any way you want and do whatever you want with that long-running process using the context under which you're using the coroutines. But essentially, for Ktor, it's not much different. All you do is write down, call your suspendable function, and then have access to all of the information as you would before. So with that, that gives you more or less a highlight of the features that we have with Ktor. There's a lot of things that we are working on right now. As I mentioned, we have made the team much larger, and we are working on the marketplace. We're working on new features. We're working on making the experience for onboarding, for testing, for deployment much better and easier, both from a tooling and from a documentation perspective. When we talk about deployment, we have support for Jetty, Tomcat, Netty, CIO. CIO is coroutines IO, and it is experimental currently. It is not recommended for production, but that is the direction we're going in regards to support for multi-platform on the server. On the client, Ktor already supports multiple platforms. So you can use the client on the JVM, on JavaScript, or on native platforms. However, for the server, we are relying on coroutines under the cover, and we're going to be using our CIO engine to go down the route of multi-platform. Containers, it supports Tomcat, Jetty, supports Java 6 through 11 or 15 or whatever we are at Java right now. I've really lost track there. And then Google App Engine, Heroku, and Docker containers. If you'd like more information, you can find it on our website, ktor.io. And of course, start.ktor.io kicks you off in starting your new application. There is also a plugin that is, it's in maintenance mode because we are also revamping the plugin with new functionality and a lot of new features, and that's in the works. But our website, ktor.io, which has recently been revamped, has a bunch of information for you to learn Ktor about. And with that, I'm done. Anton?
Nice. Thank you, Hadi. We do have questions from the audience, actually, and you can foresee what kind of questions do we have, I think. People often compare Ktor or any alternative framework to Spring because that's the elephant in the room. And the very popular question that we have...
was the elephant in the room.
Gradle.
Oh, yeah.
Gradle is, but yeah, it's actually Spring. So the most popular question in the chat right now was what would be the main motivation to use Ktor instead of Spring if Spring offers all kind of high-level support for various technologies and Kotlin as well, and specifically for Spring Reactive being added recently as like the first class support.
So, I mean, it really depends on what you're looking for and your taste, obviously, right? It's like, what is the main benefit of using Java over Kotlin? Or what is the main benefit of using Kotlin over Scala, right? What is it that you're looking for? We have created Kotlin to be, we've created Ktor to be very lightweight, very fast, and very little in terms of quote unquote magic, right? So we're trying to restrict as much as we can the use of annotations. We're trying to stay away from that. We want everything to be explicit. In addition to that, our startup time is quite fast, but it's also very lightweight in the sense that, the base you've seen that is nothing. And then as I need stuff, I install features. In addition, how you structure your application, right? How you want to structure your application. And being built from the ground up in Kotlin, we get a lot of support for idiomatic Kotlin. We get support for the routing in defining Kotlin. I believe that Spring Foo, as Sebastian also mentioned at some point, has been inspired. They've been inspired somewhat by Ktor in terms of the routing. But, it really depends on what you're looking for. We obviously do not have all of those, some of the many features that the Spring ecosystem has. But we are not thinking of adding many of those features that fall outside of the scope of what Ktor is meant to be to Ktor. But that's why we want to create the marketplace where other people will be able to add these features.
Right. So basically, to add to the first question, there is an additional one, but the same person. How would you convince the team to actually give Ktor a try instead of sticking to Spring? Because it seems that you have to reinvent so many things with Ktor that already provided by Spring out of the box. Or is there a very specific use case where Ktor shines and you want to use that?
I don't think there's like, first of all, I don't think you have to reinvent a lot. I mean, again, it depends on what you're using for Spring, right? If we're talking about an HTTP framework, which is endpoints and serialization and cookie support and all of these things, we have it. There isn't much that you need to reinvent. If we're talking about application framework that has, database support, Java Enterprise Beans, all of these things, that's obviously different. Yeah. So it really just does depend on the level of things that you're looking for. But it really, how would you convince uh, a team to kind of adopt Ktor? Really, same way that when people ask me, how would you convince someone to adopt IntelliJ IDEA over Eclipse or whatever? How would you convince someone to adopt Kotlin over Java? Focus on, if those people have any issues, if they have any problems, and if Ktor or whatever the alternative is solving those problems for them. If it is, that's your entry point. That's how you try and sell this idea, right? Because if you do not provide value to people, there's no way that they're going to really want to try something. Although, having said that, we're developers, so we're always wanting to try something. Just say new shiny. There you go. That's how you do it. You say new shiny.
Right. Yeah, you have to show the new shiny.
Yeah.
Well, okay. What else do we have? I think is the question I have seen before, but I don't think we have an answer to that officially yet. Does Ktor support API first development approach? Something like HTTP4K contract or Vertex Web API contract,
Or Swagger.
or maybe Swagger.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we support Swagger. I'm not really familiar with what was the other one you were mentioning?
Vertex.
Oh, well, yeah, okay, but that's not like any protocol around contract first. If you buy contract first, I mean, if you're talking about I define my API, yes, you're essentially defining an API. So I don't. Vertex, in fact, I would say is a little bit more low level than some of the other ones, right?
No,
I
it
mean,
was specifically about Vertex Web API contract module. I think they do
okay.
have something for this specific approach.
Okay, no, we don't have that support currently, no.
All right. Is there any concept of caching already rendered server-side HTML and reserving it if there are no changes?
Well, yeah, I mean, we have a bunch of different options for caching. Also, we have conditional support, conditional get caching. So there is support for that.
Okay. Okay, and the last one that I have here in the chat is how will the performance of the application differ if you use Ktor instead of Spring? I think it will differ. Like it's an obviously different application. It's a different code that works, but probably to actually confirm how different it is, you probably need to do some kind of a benchmark, right? And
Yes, and the best place to do that, I mean, first of all, it really depends on your code as well and what you're doing. Obviously, you can see that the startup time is very fast, the response time is very fast. From there on, it depends on what you're actually doing. There is a test benchmarks, tech empower test benchmarks. Ktor is on there. The problem is that we are paying attention to that because we haven't really been keeping our samples up to date. So sometimes Ktor doesn't show very favorably there, but we're working on updating that and making sure that things are correct there, because folks do look at that. But ultimately, as you say, Anton, you need to examine it for your scenario.
right.
But we have very little overhead with Ktor. And right now, for example, Space, which is our server-side application, JetBrains, we are running that on Ktor, and it seems to be scaling fine, at least when it comes to, and they're even using socket communications there quite heavily, WebSockets.
Indeed, indeed. All right, that was the last question. There was one off-topic question, not related to the talk, but a general one. If the session will be recorded and will the recording be available offline? And the answer is yes, the session is recorded, and the recordings will be published later after the event. So I think Thank you, Hadi, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
the insights about Ktor, and we are going for the break right now. So, bye.
Bye-bye.